I still can't believe how quickly everything fell apart. One day, Linda and I were in a comfortable routine. Weekend brunches at our favorite cafe, movies on the couch, that sense of stability I'd always valued. We'd known each other since college, and though our marriage was hardly exciting, I thought it was built on a solid foundation. I figured we'd both found what we needed: companionship, respect, a future we could trust. Then, in a matter of weeks, she decided to leave me. What made it worse was her reason. An astrologer told her we weren't ever meant to be. I felt pathetic trying to reason with her, as though logic had any place in this madness. Linda started quoting star charts, planetary alignments, and cosmic flows. She showed me scribbled notes from the astrologer, a well-known guru named Ramesh. According to him, she was trapped in a karmic cycle with me, and the only way to break free was to embrace her true destiny. Within days, she moved her clothes out, found a short-term sublet, and stopped returning my calls. Then I learned the worst part. She hadn't left me for just anyone. She left me for my brother, David. David always had a competitive streak. Growing up, he had to outdo me in everything: sports, academics, even simple board games. While I worked diligently toward steady goals, he was flamboyant and charismatic, always seeking attention. People gravitated toward him, including my parents, who seemed to admire his daring spirit. I used to rationalize that he was just wired differently, but as the years passed, his drive to overshadow me became impossible to ignore. It didn't cross my mind he'd sabotage my marriage, though. That's exactly what he did, using astrology as a ruse to worm his way into Linda's life. I found out about the bribe almost by accident. A friend told me he saw David meeting Ramesh at a fancy lounge downtown. At first, I dismissed it. Then, curiosity got the better of me, so I talked to that friend again, pressed for more details. He described how David discreetly handed over an envelope, while Ramesh nodded as though confirming instructions. I tried to pretend this was all some misunderstanding, yet a gnawing suspicion wouldn't let go. Eventually, I decided to confront Ramesh myself. I paid for a private reading, walked into his incense-filled studio, and demanded the truth. Ramesh tried to maintain his mystical facade, lighting candles and chanting a few lines about cosmic synergy. I cut him off, explaining that I knew about David's envelope. He went pale for a moment, then forced a smile, insisting it was merely a charitable donation. I pressed harder, mentioning that I had eyewitnesses. He finally caved, confessing David had paid him to fabricate the reading that convinced Linda she was destined to be with my brother. Ramesh apologized profusely, but I didn't care. His role in destroying my marriage was inexcusable. I walked out, furious and hell-bent on exposing everything. But Linda and David had already moved in together, temporarily. It was surreal. My own brother was setting up house with my wife, and nobody in the family wanted to believe it was anything but destiny. Mom and Dad were torn, asking me to keep an open mind, claiming it was Linda's choice. They refused to believe David would stoop to bribery. I could see their hesitation. They loved the idea of two family members uniting, but also felt uneasy about the circumstances. Meanwhile, Linda was completely unreachable. She blocked my number, ignoring every message I sent into the void. My anger festered like a wound. I spent nights pacing my empty living room, replaying events, wondering how I could have missed the signs. Linda's sudden fascination with horoscopes now felt like a red flag I'd chosen to ignore. Part of me wondered if I'd been too complacent as a husband, too trusting of David. Yet, the deeper truth was that Linda let herself believe a lie, and David fed it to her for his own gain. I craved revenge, but I wanted to be smart about it. Impulsive actions might backfire. I needed a plan, and patience to execute it. My first move was to gather evidence. I recorded my conversation with Ramesh, covertly of course, and made sure I had copies of those scribbled notes. I even convinced him to sign a statement verifying David's bribe. He didn't want more trouble, and I used that fear to my advantage. Next, I reached out to a lawyer friend, Danielle, to ask about my options. She told me it was possible to sue for alienation of affection in some jurisdictions, though it was rarely a slam dunk. Still, having proof gave me leverage. Now I just needed Linda and David to learn it. I waited for the perfect moment. Word reached me that David and Linda planned to host a small housewarming party. It felt absurdly quick, just weeks after leaving me, but apparently astrology had given them the green light to celebrate. I made sure to attend, despite the tension. When I showed up, everyone fell silent. Linda looked stunned, David annoyed. I calmly offered congratulations, even brought a bottle of wine. My real intention wasn't to cause a scene, but to plant doubt. Halfway through the evening, I pulled Linda aside and told her I had something that would change her entire perspective. She bristled, crossing her arms as though to shield herself. I didn't lash out. Instead, I said, "It's about Ramesh." The flicker in her eyes showed me I had her attention. I invited her to my apartment the next afternoon, promising to reveal what I'd discovered. She hesitated, but curiosity won out. David noticed us talking and stormed over, demanding to know what was going on. I smiled and said, "Congratulations again," before walking away. I left them both stewing in uncertainty. By the time the night ended, I felt a spark of satisfaction that my plan was in motion. Linda showed up the next day, looking wary. We sat in the same living room where we'd shared so many evenings, now haunted by her absence. I didn't bother with small talk. I played the recording of Ramesh admitting the bribe. She went stiff, disbelief and horror wrestling on her face. Then I showed her his signed statement. At first, she insisted it must be a misunderstanding, but as the evidence piled up, her indignation shifted to betrayal. She demanded to know why David would do this. I replied, "He's always wanted what I have. This time, it was you." She broke down in tears, anger and remorse tangling in her voice. "I've been such a fool," she said. "I believed it because I wanted to believe there was something more." I sat there, letting her process the weight of David's deception. After a few minutes, she began apologizing, begging for forgiveness, saying she'd been manipulated. Her words tumbled out in waves. She said she missed me, that she wanted to come home. I watched her cry, but my sympathy had real limits. Betrayal can't be undone with tears. It was time she realized I wouldn't take her back. I told her I understood how she felt, but I also told her she'd made her choice. When she asked if I could ever see us reconciling, I shook my head. I reminded her I'd spent weeks in a fog of misery while she played house with David. She wept, telling me she'd do anything to fix this. I stayed calm and explained I no longer trusted her. Deep in my gut, I realized I wasn't the same person who once adored her without question. This betrayal severed something vital. I said goodbye and asked her to leave my apartment. Of course, David found out about her visit. He called me that evening, half gloating, half enraged. "You couldn't wait to poison her mind, huh?" he spat. I let him rant, quietly smiling at how rattled he sounded. Eventually, I told him, "You should be grateful I haven't sued you yet." There was a silence, then a nervous chuckle. He tried to brush it off as if I was bluffing, but I made sure he understood I had proof of his fraud. With that, I ended the call. My heart pounded with adrenaline, but I felt stronger than I had in months. Linda's shift in perspective was immediate. She cut off David, moving out of his place in a rush. It created a stir in the family, with my parents calling to say Linda showed up crying on their doorstep. She confessed she'd been misled, that David had orchestrated the fiasco. My parents finally understood that their golden boy wasn't so perfect, but I refused to let them pressure me into giving Linda another chance. The damage was done. That might sound cold, but I wanted to respect myself enough not to open that door again. She'd have to live with regret. David tried apologizing too, claiming he'd been caught up in the thrill of winning at something. He said he'd never truly meant to hurt me, he just couldn't stand always being second best. I listened without a shred of pity. Whatever insecurities he battled, he had no right to wreck my life. I told him flat out that our relationship would never be the same. Perhaps in time, I'd learn to tolerate his presence, but we'd never return to brotherly camaraderie. He had opened a wound that wouldn't simply heal. His guilt was his burden. I wouldn't ease that weight. Over the following weeks, Linda bombarded me with texts and voice messages. Each time she'd ask if we could talk, saying she missed me and that she finally saw the truth about David. My replies remained polite but guarded. I had no desire to reignite a romance built on shattered trust. Meanwhile, my lawyer friend reminded me that I still had a strong legal position if I wanted to pursue a civil suit. Part of me considered it, just to make David pay. But I decided to wait, to let them both stew in the consequences of their own bad choices. In the interim, I focused on healing. I hit the gym, reclaiming parts of myself I'd let stagnate. I reconnected with old friends, started new projects at work, and even visited a therapist to sort through the betrayal's emotional fallout. Each day, I grew more certain that I deserved a fresh start, unburdened by those who'd wronged me. Still, the desire for vengeance simmered. When I saw David's social media posts bragging about his big promotion, I felt a flicker of anger. He seemed to bounce back so easily, as though what he did required no true accountability or remorse. That's when I decided to escalate. I knew David had exaggerated parts of his resume to secure that promotion. He'd boasted to me once, drunk at a family gathering, about inflating his sales numbers. I still remembered the details. Over the next few days, I gathered screenshots of his actual performance metrics and compared them to the claims he'd submitted. Then, using a new email address, I anonymously forwarded this information to his HR department. I wasn't proud of stooping to his level, but I felt it was justified. Actions had serious consequences, and he'd learned that lesson soon enough. 2 weeks later, rumors flew that David was under review. A formal investigation was launched. He tried to deny any wrongdoing, but the evidence was undeniable. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that management was furious about his deceit. He was promptly demoted, losing the shiny new title he'd paraded online. The best part was how blindsided he seemed. This was a man used to manipulating situations, and now he was the one cornered. Word got back to me that he suspected I'd exposed him. I didn't confirm or deny it. I went about my life savoring a quiet victory. Linda also faced fallout. Her friends whispered about how gullible she'd been, leaving her marriage for a con. She lost some of their respect, and even her family expressed disappointment. I heard from mutual contacts that she was living alone in a modest studio, trying to piece her life back together. People asked if I'd ever take her back. My answer never changed. I refused to degrade myself by forgiving a betrayal of that magnitude. Love can't survive that kind of wound. Instead, I poured my energy into building a new life, one that didn't revolve around her choices anymore. Occasionally, I still heard Linda's pleas through voicemails. She'd go on about redemption, about how she'd woken up from a terrible dream. She claimed she wanted to fix our marriage properly, but the illusions of soulmates and cosmic alignment had left deep scars on me. I couldn't simply erase the image of her clinging to David on the basis of some astrologer's lie. Every time I replayed that memory, I felt a renewed sense of betrayal. Perhaps some people can forgive. I couldn't, and I wouldn't force myself to pretend otherwise. My heart needed more than regretful words to mend. David eventually left town. He claimed it was for a new job opportunity, but I suspected he couldn't stand the shame. Our parents tried to smooth things over, but I refused to attend the farewell dinner. I wanted nothing to do with his final act of self-pity. Linda stayed behind, and from what I heard, she was trying to pick up the broken pieces. People told me she was depressed, that she regretted everything. Part of me felt a pang of empathy. Once upon a time, I loved her deeply, but I never let that sympathy override the boundaries I'd set. Months passed before I ran into Linda again by chance. I was leaving the grocery store, and she was standing there holding a shopping bag. She looked thinner, her eyes ringed with exhaustion. She managed a smile and asked how I was. I told her I was better, working on myself. She nodded and her gaze dropped. She apologized more softly this time, saying she understood if I refused to speak to her. I took a measured breath and said, "I wish you well, but I won't forget what happened." She seemed wounded, but I had nothing more to offer. Afterward, I felt a pang of guilt, but I reminded myself that actions have lasting repercussions. If I let her back in, I'd be telling her betrayal had no real consequences. I'd be diminishing my own worth. Life went on. Work, friends, and personal growth took center stage. I occasionally heard snippets about Linda from family gatherings. She was quieter now, less sure of herself. Sometimes I pitied her, but I never regretted my stance. My boundaries were the only things protecting me from the chaos she and David had unleashed. I wasn't about to let them crumble any further. Eventually, I met someone new. Her name was Claire, and she had a calm confidence that put me at ease. We started dating slowly, neither of us rushing. After the storm I'd weathered, I appreciated her steady warmth, her straightforward honesty. She knew about my past, and she respected my boundaries. Over time, I allowed myself to trust again, bit by bit. I found it liberating to share life with someone who valued me without cosmic gimmicks. We laughed together, built memories, and let our bond grow naturally. In her presence, I rediscovered parts of myself that betrayal had buried. One evening, I got a call from an unknown number. Linda's voice came through. She spoke softly, telling me she heard I was seeing someone else. She wanted to congratulate me, she said, but her tone wavered with sadness. She admitted she still loved me, that she'd never stop regretting what happened. I listened for a moment, waiting for anger to flare, but I felt only a distant ache. I thanked her for calling, then reiterated that I'd moved on. She asked if we could be friends someday. I told her I wasn't sure. We ended the call without resolution. Life, as it tends to do, carried on. Claire and I grew closer, solidifying the trust between us. My career advanced, and I found myself smiling more often. I realized that true partnership had nothing to do with horoscopes. It was about respect, honesty, and mutual support. David remained a distant figure, sending occasional holiday messages that I mostly ignored. Linda seemed stuck in a loop of remorse, but I didn't let that define my choices. Over time, the bitterness ebbed. I discovered that living well, finding joy again, was the sweetest form of revenge. No cosmic chart could dictate that. A year later, on a sunny Saturday, Claire and I got engaged. It was simple, a picnic in the park, a heartfelt conversation, and then I slipped a ring on her finger. We toasted with cheap champagne, both laughing at how unpretentious it felt. In that moment, I realized I'd finally let go of the resentment. Linda and David had become chapters in my story, cautionary tales of betrayal and manipulation. But they no longer completely defined me. Standing there with Claire, I felt a joyful sense of fulfillment that astrology could never promise. My future was mine to shape. Looking back, I see how fragile love can be when built on illusions. Linda once believed she had found her soulmate in my brother, all because an astrologer said so. But real love isn't about star signs or forced destiny. It's about choice, honesty, and loyalty, qualities that can't be conjured by a paid reading. In the end, David's deception destroyed the illusion he'd created. Linda discovered too late that I wasn't someone to be cast aside and reclaimed at will. My revenge was never about destroying them, it was about preserving myself, and in doing so, I found true happiness.